Good morning, everyone. Today's lesson is on the main ideas expressed in the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movements. An abolitionist is someone who fights for the freedom of all slaves. They didn't exist, obviously, after the Civil War because slaves were given freedom after the Civil War. There were two sets of people. A lot of people in the North, and believe it or not, in the South, were starting to think that slavery was cruel and inhumane, and that these people should not be held captive against their will, work for free. A lot of escaped slaves had made it to the South, and they were had made it up to the North, and they were starting to tell their story. They were going to churches, they were going to meetings, and talk about how horrible slavery was. A lot of people in the North who had never been to the South had no idea how cruel and unusual the institution of slavery was. So this was sort of an eye-opening experience for them. These abolitionists were demanding the immediate freedom of slaves, release of slaves. They believed that it was wrong for many reasons, including being morally wrong, cruel and inhumane, and they believed that it was a violation of democracy, that all people were created equally. They were right. Three of the major leaders in the abolitionist movement were, number one, Harriet Tubman. We all know that she led the Underground Railroad, they think, anywhere between 375 and 500 people from the South to freedom in the North. Also, during the Civil War, she became a spy for the Union Army and made it down to South Carolina to do that. Lloyd Garrison, who was a white guy, owned a newspaper in Boston. It was called The Liberator, and he constantly wrote articles about liberating or freeing these slaves. He wanted the immediate emancipation or freedom of the slaves. There was no easing into it. He really thought that they have to act now and they have to act quickly. He was sure that the people in the North would join with him and help him free the slaves. The third person that you've heard about and we talk about is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was what they would call he was difficult to get to work. So his master sent him to someone called a breaker. The only thing that I can think that it would equal to today is when you get a puppy and you send them to training school and they come back and they're trained. Sounds horrible, but it's the only thing that I can, in my head, make it equal to. Anyway, he got sent to this breaker, and basically one day he woke up and said, nobody's going to tell me what to do ever again. So he got into a physical fight with this man, and they fought for 10-15 minutes, fist fight. And if you've ever fought with a brother or sister for a few minutes, you know how exhausted you are. So you can imagine really fighting for that long, how tired they were. Eventually the breaker gave up and said, forget it, I can't do anything with you, go back to your master. Well, you can imagine that when he got back to his master, life was not good. He decided right then that he was going to leave. He somehow got his hands on a fake ID, fake freedom papers, and boarded a train to head north. The conductor was coming through and checking papers to make sure that everybody on the train were who they said they were, and his picture did not match himself. So the conductor was looking at him, looking at the picture, and then by the grace of God there was some disturbance in the train, and the conductor lost interest in him, gave him his papers back, and he made it to the North. When Frederick Douglass made it to the North, he was educated, he could read and write. When he made it to the North, he wrote a newspaper called the North Star, and this North Star worked for making the lives of African Americans better in the North. Freed African Americans could come there and find jobs, places to stay, things like that. Frederick Douglass did get the opportunity to speak to Lincoln. President Lincoln, when he became president, he did not become president to end slavery. He was what they call a free soiler. He wasn't going to let slavery spread, but he thought that the institution of slavery would still exist in the South. Fortunately, after talking to people like Frederick Douglass and other people, he changed his stance on slavery and eventually wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. And when the states came back into the Union after the Civil War, they had to change their state constitution to make slavery illegal. On the other side of the coin, all these people were fighting for the freedom of slaves, and women as well, women and men. And all of a sudden, someone said, wait, we're fighting for all these freedoms for African Americans, but women don't have a lot of these freedoms also. So, supporters of the suffrage movement had sort of a banner that said all men and women are created equal. They believed that women deserve the same rights as men, and women should have the right to vote, the right to educational opportunities, especially to attend college. Ladies back then, if you were lucky enough to be educated in the South, you probably came from a wealthy plantation owner as your father. In the North, if you went to school, you didn't go past high school, that's for sure. They wanted equal rights to own businesses, and they wanted to be able to own property individually. When you married back then, anything that you had or that your father left you became property of your husband. So women were starting to want the right to keep their own stuff. The suffrage movement was led by several strong women. One is Susan B. Anthony. She became an advocate for voting rights for women. Lots of marches and equal rights for all, not just women, but simultaneously they were, wanting the abolition of slavery as well. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of Sojourner Truth's best friends, and she was also a leader in the women's rights movement. Isabel Sojourner Truth, she was a former enslaved African American and became nationally known advocate for equality and justice. She was on the circuit to go around to churches and meeting houses and speak to these people and let them know that women could do just as much as men. She was a slave in New York. After many years of cruelty under several different masters, she ran away, taking her baby daughter with her. In 1827 in New York, when slavery ended, she was finally free. She found great comfort in religion and began preaching about God's love for all. She changed her name to mean one who is searching to find the truth. Her work for equal rights and justice for all people, black and white, along with her wonderful speeches, brought her great fame. So people paid her to hear her speak. This is one of her more famous speeches. I'm just going to quote a little bit. Apparently she was in a meeting house and men were standing up talking about how women can't do the same thing men can. They're weak and they need help doing things. And this was her response to that. She said, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best places everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" So she was saying, look, all this stuff happened to me. This is my life. And I did it. And I'm a woman. Women can do exactly what men can do. Suffrage means the right to vote in an election. We know that women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So this year marks the 100th anniversary that women have had the right to vote. Not that long when you think about this country was founded 400 years ago, over 400 years ago. It's just, we're very lucky to live in the time that we live. Yeah, there's some stuff going on that's not the best, but considering we have a lot of rights just for being in this country, and we should be, you know, thankful for that and not take them for granted. So we talked about the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison. And then when we talked about the suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Isabella Sojourner Truth are the three women. Next week, we're going to get into reasons, what the differences between the North and South, and a lot of reasons why we fought the Civil War. The last week will be on the fighting of the Civil War. 2 more weeks to go. All right, guys, stay safe. I miss you.